pronouns if you're comfortable, organizational affiliation or community that you live in and work in, and what is one thing that you're hoping to gain from today's session. So again, before we start, if you are comfortable, you are welcome to keep your video on if you can. It's a lot nicer presenting to some faces rather than just blank squares. So I really appreciate it for folks that I can see. Try and use I statements. We all come to this training with different lived experiences, different work histories, different communities that we inhabit. So, you know, all of those experiences are valid and we don't need to make any of those invalid. Assume good faith. You know, folks might have questions about the advocacy process. That's totally okay. We're here to learn together. And finally, this is not a space for debate for policy priorities. I know we might have different thoughts about how to make our food system more better for all and more equitable and more sustainable. And we're not here to really debate those. So what are we going to do today? We're going to go over some basics of what policy is, what policy isn't, go over some basics for an advocacy campaign, hopefully have time for a question and answer and an interactive activity. And then we'll focus on building a baseline understanding of how policy affects us, why it's important to pay attention to, and how to make change. I'm loving these introductions in the chat. Thank you so much, folks. I love seeing the community fridges represented, Mass in Motion, All Farmers, John from the Food Project, New England Vegetable and Berry Growers. This is great. Lots of great representation today. So what is policy? Policy is a set of rules that outlines what a government body should and shouldn't do. It guides government programs, government spending, and activities. It also shows our values, right? Like budgets are moral documents. They tell us what we do and do not value. You can see those values expressed in laws, regulations, budgets, as I mentioned, other measures that prescribe policy steps that will be taken to support or enforce or promote those values. Policy shapes the playing field. It can enforce the status quo or create and support equity. Policy can be both proactive and move towards a goal or reactive and try to avoid an outcome. So these are the three main layers of policy in Massachusetts. We have the state constitution, which lays out the rights for citizens and structure of the government for the Commonwealth. Laws, which are a set of statutes that describe programs and practices that will uphold the values expressed in the Constitution. And regulations, which are basically rules for how state agencies administer the programs or regulate the practices expressed in those laws. And all of these interact in varying ways that could be more messy than described in this slide. Some of you know me as the Campaign for Healthy Incentives Program Manager, which HIP is a great example for this. It exists in regulations, but not in law yet, which, you know, we're hoping to change. And so policy change can have a lasting impact because it can change the rules that communities, corporations or organizations and governments must follow. So often short-term informal solutions don't really get at the problem's root cause, and policy change tries to get at those root causes and change the system instead of reacting to it. So see, these are some of the effects policy has on us already. These are a couple of recent bills that passed to the Massachusetts legislature. The climate change bill just passed the Senate and again, the House this week for the third time. It's heading to the governor's desk. We'll see what happens next. And then last session, if you were paying attention to our schools, you might have seen the Student Opportunity Act pass, which really redid the way that we fund schools in Massachusetts. And you can see this article was published recently from Massachusetts State Senator Sonia Chang Diaz about her experience advocating for that bill. Again, these are just two recent examples of pretty large bills. There's always a lot going on in the legislature, but policy is important to pay attention to, again, because you can make systemic change. And why be a policy advocate? Feel free to add in the chat why you are interested in this training, but again, policy advocacy is one way you can make long-lasting change. It's essentially one way to make your contribution to changing the system rather than reacting to how the system is making daily life difficult or stressful for you and others in your field. the role of an advocate is really to educate legislators in your community about what change we can make and what change is possible to make, and kind of agitate for a piece of legislation you'd like to see passed, or a piece of legislation you'd like to see changed, or a budget amendment that you'd like to see included. Policies are, again, made by a governing body. So in Massachusetts, the state legislature, the governor, city councils and select boards, and mayors. So experts help create those policies and help write them and help predict how those policy changes can affect our communities. And each body represents thousands of people, right? Like a city mayor represents roughly 50,000 plus people, and a state legislature represents so many people. But each of them has to make decisions about a pretty wide range of issues. So those experts are important. And you all in this Zoom room are experts in your communities, right? Like, you are the experts. You know best what work is going on in your organization, in your community. So you are important to those legislators, right? Like, you have a firsthand knowledge of how policies impact you and your communities. You're in a great position to push for policy change, to educate policymakers about needed change, and empower your community to lead that effort. Policymakers really need to hear from you to know what's going on in their communities, right? Like, policymakers have a lot going on, and there's a lot of issues going on in, like each legislative session with representatives and senators, or on a city council even. So really, like, being informed by folks like you is really important to policymakers. Economic conditions and social situations change often and create the need for policy. So public sentiment about the role of government and the priorities it should focus on is also consistently shifting. So policy is, again, regularly updated and reviewed to ensure that it reflects those changes, and you can advocate as those changes occur. And Raz, we'll talk about the difference between advocacy and lobbying a little bit later. We'll get to that. Okay, so this might look familiar to some folks. This is how a bill becomes a law in Massachusetts. If you grew up in the 90s like I did, you might have seen the Schoolhouse Rock video about how a bill becomes a law. I definitely encourage folks to review that because it's very similar to how we do it in Massachusetts, but essentially, this is a pretty general outline. There are exceptions, like the climate bill that just passed again this yeah, I love that video too, John. Like the climate bill that passed again this week, essentially, this is for like brand new legislation. So a bill is proposed. So a Massachusetts senator or representative files a bill. You can talk to your representatives and senators to ask them to file legislation for you. Massachusetts is also a petition state, so you can like file a piece of legislation through your legislator and they won't technically be considered like a sponsor of that bill. And then other members of the legislature will sign on and support as co-sponsors. That's definitely a point for advocacy. Getting more co-sponsors signals more support in a chamber. Once that bill has been filed, check to make sure it's legal with the Chamber's council. A hearing is held, so bills will be assigned to committees that work on issues related to those addressed in the proposal, and then there are public hearings required to provide an opportunity for input, so you can either write testimony in support of or against a bill. Excuse me. You can, once that committee has held a hearing on the bill, they discuss it amongst themselves and they move the bill. They either reject the bill, vote to support it, refer it to another committee that might also have work expertise on that area related to that bill, or advance it. The second committee will again consider the bill, propose changes, approve the revised version if it's been revised, and then it makes it to the full chamber. So like the entire House or Senate will vote to approve or reject the bill. If it's approved, it's sent to the other chamber for consideration, and then the governor signs or vetoes the bill. Or the governor can propose changes and send it back to the legislature, and then we kind of go through the process again. Again, this is a very general overview of the process. There are lots of ways that bills can, go through the process differently. I'm just going to use the climate bill because it's recent this week. You might have seen it like just be introduced, and there was a special committee called to review it and pass it quickly because it was passed at the end of last session in winter of 2020. For food system advocates, don't assume that, there are only certain committees to pay attention to. Food system bills get assigned to a lot of different committees. Like we've seen them get assigned to the Judiciary Committee, of course, ENRA, the Environment, Natural Resources and Agriculture, or sometimes they'll go straight to Ways and Means. And again, there are different points for advocacy at each of these steps in the process. So another major piece of, sorry, I'm trying to read the chat at the same time. Another point of advocacy beyond bills is the state's operating budget. So you might have heard like the state's fiscal budget is getting filed by the governor early in January this year, after it was pretty late last year. So this is a broad outline. This obviously was different last year. Last year was not a normal year, but hopefully this year we'll be on a more regular schedule with the operating budget. Generally in fall, state agencies and departments submit their budget requests to the governor. This is a pretty good time to meet with commissioners or secretariats. And you can ask them to fund certain programs or figure out what they're going to be asking the governor for funding. It's also a good time to send requests straight to the governor. In early January, the governor will propose the budget. So it's usually called House 1 in the first year of a legislative session, or House 2 in the second year of a legislative session. In January to March, the House Ways and Means Committee will hold public hearings. Right now, I think this week they held the third one on various pieces of the budget because it's a pretty large document. And then they'll draft a budget proposal after those hearings. You can send emails, you can call, you can also try and get meetings with the committee chair and committee members. That's pretty effective during this time, and you can ask for appropriate funding for your priorities. In April, the House Ways and Means Committee will release its budget proposal to the full House to vote on. Members will often offer amendments. You'll probably see about 7 or 8 pages of amendments, making a couple hundred of them total. And members will debate the bill and its amendments, and the full body votes each up or down. They often get consolidated into large packages. You'll see them as like Consolidated A, Consolidated B on the legislature's website, and those are usually by like topic area. So for food system areas, it's usually like if there have been a couple of amendments around food pantry funding, for example. And so during this time, advocates can focus on getting their representatives to sponsor and co-sponsor amendments that are important to them if funding in the proposed budget was insufficient, and then to support their inclusion in the final budget. So again, continue. This is a fairly long process, but it gets really meaty starting in April to June. In May, the Senate Committee on Ways and Means holds hearings and drafts a budget. So basically the same process, but in the other chamber. Again, emails, calls, and meetings are effective during this time to Senate committee chairs and committee members, and to ask for appropriate funding for your priorities. In June, Senate Ways and Means releases its budget proposal to the full Senate. Members will offer amendments and debate the bill in each amendment and vote up or down. So again, you can focus your attention on getting senators to sponsor or co-sponsor amendments if the funding in the proposed budget was insufficient, and again, to include their priorities in the final budget. In June, once both the House and the Senate have passed their versions of the budget, a conference committee is formed to reconcile any changes between the Senate and House budgets and propose a joint budget for both chambers to vote on. This budget can't be amended. So in June, this is usually later in the month, letters to the conference committee members can be effective during this time. So you can let them know which budget best reflects the funding you'd like to see for your priorities. And then By June 30th, though this can often be a little bit later, the governor will sign veto or veto parts of the budget, suggest changes for the legislature to consider. Again, this often comes down to the wire or isn't completed in time, and a short-term budget can be passed so that the state government can continue to function while the budget is being finalized. During this time, you can call or email the governor's office to express support for funding for your priorities. And again, in recent years, we've seen this be delayed through July or sometimes later. Last year was kind of a weird year, so it's a bit of an exception. The Mass Budget and Policy Center has a lot of really easy to find information on how budget spending has changed over the years. You can look up specific line items and they'll have about the last 10 years of budget items down. And I'll put that link in the chat at the end of the training. And yes, to the question in the chat about the slides, yeah, we'll definitely share them after the after the training, and don't feel rushed to get all of the notes down. It's totally okay to just listen. So just a quick note on operating budgets. They usually follow this timeline. But again, this is kind of like an idealized version of the process. If the legislature chooses to take up a vetoed item for an override vote, a 2/3 vote of both the House and Senate can override the governor's veto. And throughout the fiscal year, the fiscal situation changes a lot. So supplemental budgets can be introduced to accommodate that changing situation. Again, as with the annual budget, both chambers and the governor must sign off on those items. It also depends on the capacity of the legislature to get those done. Sometimes it can be done within a couple weeks. Sometimes the supplemental budgets can drag on for a couple months. And of course, if revenue falls below expectations, the governor is authorized to make cuts to most budget items. And then we have the capital budget, which is a little bit less well-known than the operating budget. You'll see these as really large bond bills with certain dollar amounts attached to them. Those dollar amounts aren't spent when those bills are passed. They just give the governor borrowing authority for those categories of things included in the bill. So you'll see sometimes they have a lot of infrastructure projects. Sometimes they have capital grant programs. It really depends on the capital bill that's being passed, but essentially the governor has the authority each year to issue a capital budget based on previously passed budgets that have been passed by the legislature. Again, they tend to fund big capital projects and grant programs, like if you pay attention to MDAR's APR program or agricultural preservation restriction, which helps preserve farmland. Those are funded through capital budgets. And the process is a little bit more simplified than the operating budget, but it essentially goes this way. State agency will come up with their requests and then they'll send them to the secretariat. So MDAR will send their request to the Secretary of Energy and Environmental Affairs, which governs a lot of different state agencies. The Secretary of EEA will then review those requests, decide if they agree with them, and then send their final request to the governor. The governor will review all of the secretary's requests and then decide what to spend. So those are 3 different advocacy opportunities, right? So you have the state agency, you have the secretary, and then you have the governor's office. All right, so we're gonna switch over to advocacy campaign basics. I'm just gonna pause. If you have questions about what I just went over, you can feel free to unmute. I don't really have an eye on the chat, so feel free to go for that.
Hi, I wrote a question and, oh, it's coming. So Winton just said it's coming. Maybe this is exactly what you're about to share. So never mind.
I see. Okay, yeah, I see your question now. Yeah, we'll go over that in a couple slides. So thank you for asking.
I have a quick question. Do you find that when bills are requested by constituents that they're more likely to be the first ones cut and like above when like the budget goes over, or do you think it just really depends on like the support and like the discretion of the governor?
So bills that are introduced by constituents are not usually likely to make it through the process of like how a bill becomes a law. Budget amendments, if you talk, budget amendments are separate.
Okay.
Because there's about, I think the last time I checked, it was about 6,000 different bills filed each session, and the legislature gets through a lot less than that because, you know, we have limited time in 2 years. But if you have like if you have a budget amendment that's important to you, then you can get your legislator to sponsor that. And oftentimes if it's, you know, something that is pretty popular or important in their district, that will make it through because each legislator usually has like a couple of priorities that they can talk to the committee chair of Ways and Means about in meetings or throughout the process.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else? Yeah, and I'm sorry, I mean, when I say constituents, I do mean voters, residents, folks like us.
That's what I meant too. Thank you.
All right. So we're going to work through like the basics of how to create an advocacy campaign. This is again like a generalized process, and there are ways to, you know, go about it differently. These aren't really secrets. These are pretty well known throughout the, you know, like the nonprofit advocacy sphere. So again, we will make these slides available. Don't feel like you need to take screenshots. We also have resources on our website to go over this in more detail. So the first step of like creating an advocacy campaign is identifying an issue. So these are a couple of questions to ask yourself. They're obviously specific to food system issues, but they could be used for, they could just be changed and used in different situations, like for housing or transportation. Some of the biggest are, you know, what are the biggest challenges facing your farmer community right now? What goals do you most want to achieve in the future? What stands between you and achieving your goals? Does government make it harder or easier to achieve those goals? Is your challenge or goal unique to you, or is it also relevant to your community? And so policy change can happen, again, in a couple different ways that I just went over. So in state law, so you can propose a bill to change state law. In budgets, so you can ask to increase funding for your priorities. You can advocate at different points for agency regulations, which happen at any time. And then you can also advocate at the municipal level for municipal policies. Sorry. If the issue you're having or the issue you have in mind involves government and affects a broad group of people, then, you know, considering a policy solution makes sense, right? If a policy or law is creating the problem, then you could propose to change or repeal that law. If the lack of a policy or the lack of a law is the issue, we sometimes see this in emerging industries, you could propose a new one. Your problem may be a lack of resources, which you could request more funds in the budget. In some cases, the problem may not exist yet, but a proposal being considered poses a potential threat. In that case, you can advocate against that proposal. All of these are different policy solutions, right? So once you've identified an issue, you want to build your case for that. So think about what level of government you need to target. Keep in mind that policy changes of lower levels of government are often easier to change, right? So, you know, municipal policies might be easier to change than state policies. State policies are easier to change than federal policies. To be effective, you and your campaign needs to convince policymakers that your solution is needed and easy to implement. So making a plan to build this campaign will help you organize information in an important and persuasive way. So 3 components of building a case are need, ease, and credibility. Need is like demonstrating the need for a policy change, a program, or increased funding through stories. Personal stories are really effective. Data are also really persuasive, but legislators are usually up to their eyes in data, so they can often do their own research. So personal stories are always really important. Again, some of you know me as the campaign for HIP funding manager, so personal stories of HIP farmers and consumers have really helped us build the case over the years. They're really impactful. You can see some of them on our YouTube channel, which I'm happy to link later. Ease is, showing that your desired policy solution is both desired and feasible. That means the policy will work smoothly, isn't too controversial, and won't be too expensive. One way to show this is if another state or town has successfully implemented a similar policy. You can talk to those people in those states or cities. Often people reach out to me about HIP and are really excited about it. And it's really nice to hear from other folks that really want to implement policies in their own communities, right? Like people will be excited about that. But try not to copy another law or regulation, right? Like different states have different laws. It won't necessarily be a one-to-one match. And of course, each situation is different. You need to make sure that your proposal is the exact response needed for your unique situation. And credibility, as we've already discussed, you are the experts in your community. Building relationships can be just as important as building your policy proposal. So you can build trust by showing policymakers who you are, what you do, and why this policy is important to you. So once you have your case built, you should find allies and build a coalition around that ask. So start with the most obvious allies. These could be organizations you've already partnered with or work with on a daily or semi-regular basis around your chosen issue, or those that share your mission or values. Advocacy is usually most effective in a larger group or coalition. That's why we talk about building coalitions, right? Like it's really hard for one organization to carry an issue all the way through this process. And of course, you want to demonstrate that like a policy change will have impact in a broad swath of communities or at a state level or like throughout the city if you're talking about a municipal level. If an organization already exists that could potentially help you with your coalition, don't try and reinvent the wheel. Just try and work with them so you can invest more time and energy in advocacy, right? So there's already like a lot of public health organizations that might have data or research that could be helpful to your campaign if you're trying to build a campaign around healthy food. You should also consider how your issue might affect the environment. Public health is a pretty big one for food issues. The economy, labor, or transportation. To build your coalition, you can reach out and engage with folks that, people or organizations that care about other issues your policy might impact, racially, demographically, and economically diverse people and organizations that represent those affected by the issue, people and organizations that might be opposed to your policy to kind of thwart any opposition and or like real dissuade any concerns that they may have, and organizations that can mobilize members or existing networks. Then you can think about people and organizations that you might not have worked with before, but that might care about this issue. So think about who is impacted by the issue. Don't limit yourself to nonprofit organizations, businesses, trade organizations, and other institutions that are concerned with your issue can also be important allies. And reach out early while you're developing the campaign. Folks are more likely to lend support and and get involved early if you've reached out to them while you're still building the campaign and make sure that their voice is heard. All right, so there are a lot of different ways that organizations can participate, and keep in mind that what they'll be able to do will likely depend upon their size and resources, but of course, everyone has a role to play in a campaign. So small organizations can help by signing on to letters, spreading the word to their members, sharing information on social media. Social media is a really powerful tool that we'll talk about in a little bit. Medium organizations can also do what small organizations can and dedicate staff time and write or review materials. Large organizations can do the above and also dedicate staff time and or lobbyists to campaign. And of course, remember to center folks with lived experience who may not be part of an organization, but might be affected by your issue in a campaign. And of course, equity, making sure that you are representing a wide swath of folks, centering the most affected, and trying to stay focused on the issue. You know, campaigns can get pretty wide pretty quickly, so try and stay focused on that ask that builds the need, builds credibility. So again, what is an ask? An ask is something that every campaign needs. It's what you're asking the legislature or the body of government that you're trying to change. What the ask is essentially like what you're asking them to do. So it needs to be clear, specific, and directed at the appropriate agency or body that has the authority to implement that ask. Know your issue. It's important that you and your partners in this advocacy campaign know and are familiar with your issue. Try and learn all you can about the laws, regulations, and budgets related to your issue, the history behind them, and past efforts to change them. The legislature's website is a pretty good resource for this. It can be a little bit clunky, but definitely try and use it, and I'm happy to go through that with anyone offline. While your ask might be detailed or complex, try and make sure that you develop simple, clear materials that explain your ask and why it's needed. So for me, with the HIP campaign, I'm just going to keep using it as an example. We have a sort of complex ask because we want them to do one thing that has about 3 different impacts. So we want them to increase funding so the program can operate year-round, add new farmer vendors, and support increased participation in SNAP families that use HIP. But we try and make sure that that ask is really clear and really easy for our coalition members to take action on. So when you're targeting the ask, with new policy, it means you're starting from scratch. You will need to define the issue, research solutions, and think about what policies and practices you want to change. Don't worry about getting the exact legalese right. There are experts in the state government or in city council that have that expertise. You just need to state your proposal clearly. And legislative or agency staff will draft the legal language for filing the actual bill or regulatory change. And new state laws go through the process that we discussed with Schoolhouse Rock on slide 8, I think it was. And if you're supporting or opposing a bill, it's a little bit different. You can either, your main task is really to track that bill's progress. That way you're ready to offer input at the first opportunity that that bill makes, takes the next step in that process. So if you oppose or support proposed legislation, you'll want to know what committee the bill is assigned to, when the first hearing is for that bill. You can try and get meetings with the members of that committee or the chair of that committee. If you care about new regulations, you can watch for the publication of draft regulations, deadlines for public comments, and public hearing dates. We saw a lot of this over the past 4 years with federal level regulations. While you wait for those opportunities, you can build support behind the scenes. You can rally allies and set up conversations with key policymakers. The best approach is usually to join forces with existing coalitions working on the issue and work directly with them to help improve the bill. Or if you oppose a bill, try to be constructive instead of negative. The fact that policymakers are discussing your issue is an opportunity to educate them, right? Again, you're the experts in your community. One way to do this is to support amendments or changes to a bill rather than opposing it outright. Then you can explain to policymakers why your version of the bill is stronger than the originally proposed version in hearings or in written testimony. Policymakers will be pretty attentive to constructive suggestions for change to their proposals rather than outright opposition. All right, and ways to do this, again, communicating with legislators. There's a variety of ways to do this. You can create one-pagers. So again, just gonna rely on HIP here. You might have seen our one-pager for HIP. It has facts, so who your coalition represents and what your work is on the issue, what the problem is, so what's not working and what will happen if your proposal does not get passed, what the solution is, so what you propose, why it's important to you, details, so who will be impacted and how, and then what happens if this doesn't happen, what is the unintended consequence of not passing this bill. So why this matters now, could be like a timing issue, like if this if this bill doesn't get passed, then this program might not exist in the future. And then cost of the proposed change and your contact info. So that's a one pager, and that's usually to legislators, so, or like state agency regulators, folks that you're trying to impact. You can also create a talking points sheet for your coalition so that you're all on the same page. It's really easy to communicate. You're all like using shared language. That should probably include data that backs up all the points that you're making, information about the relevant existing laws or regulations, real life examples of the impact your proposal would have, lists of allies or coalition members, and other information that might be needed to answer policymakers' questions. So timing, it depends again on like how you're trying to affect policy, but for creating a new bill, there is a deadline in early January at the start of each new session. So that was like the third Wednesday in January is when bills are supposed to be filed by. This session, it's been extended because of the coronavirus pandemic. So that's when you should try and, talk to legislators before, try and get them to help you and like write a bill and get that filed before that deadline. For the budget process, it depends, we talked about earlier, we can implement, we can affect change through the committees at various points during the spring usually. And for regulations and changes to them, it can really be anytime. And so you can affect change through calls to action. We talked about those different budget points of action. So I usually send out emails to the coalition at various points of that action. We've seen the House Ways and Means budget be implemented, and that didn't have enough money for HIP. So we're going to have someone introduce an amendment. Can you call your legislator and ask them to co-sponsor that? If you're leading an advocacy campaign, you will create these calls to action, other alerts to let people know how they can participate by contacting policymakers. Try and make it as easy as possible for people to do what you're asking, so you can include legislators' contact info. You can include, you can include your talking points again. You can include what you'd like them to do and how to talk about it on social media, just really like lots of different ways to go about that. And so, sorry, my computer's being a little funky. How to reach policymakers. So policymakers are people, right? So remember that they work for you. They're elected in the terms of like state legislators or city councilors. Regulatory agencies are a little bit different, but they still work for the public. So you can reach them just like you would anyone else. So phone calls, email, letters, virtual meetings now in the age of Zoom. You can set up a meeting. If you're calling or emailing or writing a letter, that should usually include some like your information, your organization, your contact info, like a brief background on the issue, and the legislator's connection to it, a clear specific ask, right? We talked about developing that, an explanation of why the ask is important to you, an invitation to contact you or the central network contact for the coalition if they have questions, and a request for a reply about their position on the issue. That's important, right? And again, be sure to thank them if they support the ask and thank them for their time. You can also create sign-on letters, try and reach legislators through social media. A lot of legislators can be directly reached on platforms like Twitter and Facebook. You can write op-eds and letters to the editor to get published in local newspapers. That's pretty effective. You can also try and get earned media for an issue, and you can, again, testify at public hearings. So assuming that you've reached a legislator and you've set up a meeting, you can, there are a couple of basic points to keep in mind when you're in a meeting with a legislator. So those are try and tell personal stories. We've talked about that already a little bit, but again, legislators and other officials are usually bombarded with data and they can do their own research if needed, but your personal story is unique to you. And that sharing personal stories and examples is a really powerful way to get folks to really understand like the actual impact on the ground of a program or a policy change or a budgetary issue. So these stories should show how your issue affects the people, businesses, and communities that the policymaker serves. So think about who the best messengers are, recruit them to participate and help them tell their stories effectively. Again, with HIP, I usually invite a farmer and a consumer to attend meetings because they are the actual folks who operate and use the program on a day-to-day basis. Be positive. While all asks are designed to fix a problem, it's better to focus on the positive results of your solution and not the negative aspects of the current situation. If you want to improve an existing program or policy, you can point out how effective it's been already. And if you can give credit to the state agency or body that enforces or manages it, so that you're reinforcing that positive impact of an existing public program, and appreciate your policymaker support for it in the past, that also helps. And of course, like, be polite. Like, they're people too. Their staff are people. Their staff are really hardworking. And again, this is kind of a side point, but like, don't underestimate staff. Staff get a lot of work done. And they're more likely to consider your ask if you treat them with respect, right? Golden rule. Whenever communicating with policymakers or their staff, thank them for any past support related to your issue. Recognize that they're working on many issues at once and thank them for their time. Policymakers or staff who aren't supportive of your ask may be important allies later on. For other issues, to look at these relationships as long-term and complex rather than transactional or short-term. Basically, the more you get to know these folks, the more open and honest you can be with one another. And of course, as an ending point in a meeting, you should make your ask. So that's kind of like in a meeting with legislators, but before you're meeting with policymakers, you can generally like kind of like do a prep session. So generally it just helps to like make sure that you're well prepared for this meeting. So just asking yourself, how has the policymaker acted on related issues previously? Are there other issues or other important pieces of legislation being considered that relate to your ask? How does your issue affect this policymaker's constituents? What other policymakers support your position? And like, is this policymaker, do they have a relationship with those other policymakers? What organizations and policymakers oppose your position? How could you respond to that opposition? What process will your proposal have to go through? So budget process, bill becoming a law, then working through the regulations. What action steps are required and how can the policymaker help? And what other questions might the policymaker or staff have? And again, as these are like long-term complex relationships, try and maintain that relationship even when you don't have an immediate ask. And of course, everyone wants to know how you win. So of course, there's no one formula to winning an advocacy campaign. If a legislative session ends and your bill doesn't pass, don't be discouraged. That happens. It's pretty rare for a bill to pass in the first session it's introduced. You can always file your legislation again in the following year and tweak your proposal based on lessons learned during the campaign. This is always an opportunity to build on existing alliances if that happens. No matter the outcome, building an engaged group of allies around your issue or your cause is a victory and a reason to celebrate. So even though we didn't get the enabling legislation passed last session for HIP, I still try and make sure that everyone in the coalition makes sure that they feel thanked and feel part of a larger body that's moving in this one goal. That's really important to make sure that folks feel valued because they did put in their time to this goal that you're all working towards. If you do win, be sure to issue a press release or try and get in contact with your local media, and then talk with your allies about what issues you want to tackle next now that you've clearly established yourself as an effective force for change. Again, I'm just going to say, like, building a relationship with your representative or legislators that make decisions on issues. So like committee chairs for both bills and budgets early on is really helpful. Get to know them and make sure they understand that you're an expert and an important part of your community, and keep at it. You know, issues can sometimes take multiple legislative cycles to get through. And so this is our fun advocacy versus lobbying disclaimer. I am not a lawyer, so please don't take this as legal advice, but this has been an issue that's been brought up by a lot of folks in nonprofit spaces before. So in Massachusetts, lobbying includes time spent communicating with a government employee or elected official, whether it's written, whether it's over the phone, or if it's face-to-face. Lobbying also includes any strategizing, planning, or research connected with communications with a government employee or elected official. Executive lobbying happens when you try to influence agency regulations. Legislative lobbying is advocacy related to legislation, including trying to influence the governor to approve or veto legislation. So you have to register as a lobbyist with the state if you plan to spend more than 25 hours total doing either executive or legislative lobbying in a 6-month period of time, and you'll be paid for your work. So that's important. If you don't plan to communicate with a government employee, you do not have to register. If you are unsure how these rules apply to you, please contact the lobbyist division at the Secretary of State for guidance. And they also have information on their website about this that's more detailed than what I can cover right now. So that's a useful resource that folks should definitely know about. And this is just something that we wanted to make sure that folks are aware of. A lot of folks get spooked around the difference between lobbying and advocacy, and there are definitely steps that you can take, whether you're an individual or you're part of an organization that maybe you were a little bit nervous about before. All right, so I just talked for a really long time. So thank you for sticking with us. It is 10:51, so we were going to do an interactive activity, but I think we'll just pause for questions and then close out. So again, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. So if folks want to unmute, you are welcome to. No questions? You're all really? Is it a Friday morning and everyone's feeling ready to go for the weekend? That's understandable.
I don't really have a question, but I've always wanted to be an advocate, and I feel like all the information has been so great. I'm just nervous. Like it seems so scary to me. And just doing that first step and that first time of reaching out, even if it's just like I work with the Greater Boston Food Bank, and we had a meeting, a bi-weekly meeting, and they talked about advocacy, maybe doing some one-on-one training as well. And they basically said, you know, it's like, if you have a Twitter account, they said that's really cool to like be able to do that. So it's like I feel like calling for me would be a little bit scary until I become a little bit more well-versed in what I want to say and the issues I want to talk about, which is mostly food related at this moment. So I think just practice, right? Practice, practice, practice. So. So we'll see. Cheers to the first time and many, many more.
That's definitely a common feeling. I think, not to be biased, but definitely amongst millennials, because I consider myself a millennial. You know, we don't really call, we text. That is, you know, again, totally understandable, but as I've said, legislators are just people. So you can definitely practice like with a friend, or if you want to like practice with me, I'm happy to do that. Just like as a one-on-one, and you know, their job requires them to listen to us, right? That's really important to remember. And then if you're part of a campaign, it's really important for whoever's leading that to make it as easy as possible for you to participate. So if you have questions about like how to best talk about an issue, try and get in touch like with like the advocacy folks at Greater Boston Food Bank, for example. They are really well versed in their issue areas, and they can definitely practice with you, or like a organization that you work with that, you know, you might not be working for them day to day, but they are the experts in their area, and you can ask them about that.
Perfect. Thank you, Becca. I already feel better actually, so thanks.
That's awesome to hear. And yeah, Sarah, I think it depends on the municipality's rules, so we can talk about that offline. Nicolette, you have your hand raised.
Hi, yeah, I was wondering how interconnected would advocacy and the Food Policy Council of Massachusetts be? Like, how hand in hand could you be working with them? How much are they your friends? Like, what's your, you know, being more grassroots based, are they your best bet to like be intertwined with what they're working on? Those are all very general questions, but I'll leave it there.
For sure. So for folks who might not be as knowledgeable, the Mass Food Policy Council is a state level body. So it includes commissioners from a bunch of different departments like MDR. I'm forgetting the other ones right now. I'm sorry. And a couple of legislators from the Food System Caucus, which was formed a couple of years ago. I haven't been to a meeting so in a couple of months, so forgive me. I don't really see an issue working with them. They generally like have meetings once a quarter to keep folks updated on what's going on in the food system broadly. Their public meetings are a good opportunity to get, you know, their input on a proposed change that you would like to implement. They're usually the folks that are like in the legislature or are the state agency commissioners are usually pretty knowledgeable. So it's a good point to like ask them for feedback. I don't think that they can necessarily be strong advocates since some of them, you know, are state commissioners. But those legislators, since they're already on that body, they'll probably be pretty knowledgeable and will probably want to talk to you about an issue that relates to the food system. But that's just my opinion. Wynton might have a different one since he goes to their meetings more regularly than I do, but. And to Molly's question in the chat, yeah, I agree with Wynn, but like personal stories, photos. If you're a farmer, I'm just gonna use HIP as an example again. If you're a farmer, like quotes from your customers are really important and powerful. Legislators are bombarded with data every day, and you will stand out if you use personal stories and testimony from folks impacted by an issue. All right. Any more questions? All right, well, if no one has any more questions, I think we can close out. I will send this recording out to the folks that were unable to make it. I know that there's a lot packed in, so don't worry about if you're, trying to keep up with the notes, I think that's kind of unreasonable. I will be sending out a report that the collaborative did a couple of years ago that I was heavily referencing during this presentation. I will send out the slides. If you have any more questions, feel free to just get in touch directly. We have more resources about the distinction between advocacy and lobbying for nonprofit organizations on our website. And there are a lot of ways to get involved with legislation over the next couple of months, especially. So here are our priorities. Those are the bills that will be top of our list in this session. I'll put my email in the chat. And we'll also be working on our budget priorities in the next couple of months, which, as you saw with the timeline, are coming up pretty quickly. So we hope that you will, take that into consideration with advocacy that you'd like to be involved with the food system. Again, the budget is a moral statement, and especially this year, we need to prioritize food security. So we will be pretty involved on that in the next couple of months. So thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it. You all had really great questions, and I hope you feel a little bit more prepared to advocate for your priorities.
Thank you very much. Have a good day.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you.